being yeah. So I welcome you back again for the second technical session. We have another speaker from Italy, Dr. Professor Marco Cantonetti. Professor, I will briefly introduce Professor Marco. Professor Marco Cantonetti is presently head of the Limnology and Phycology section, Museo degli Scienze, MUSI, Trento, Italy. After completing his MSc at the University of Pavia in 1990 and MSc in Natural Resources in the same university in 1992, Professor Marco did his PhD in freshwater science at the University of Innsbruck, Austria in 1998. Professor Marco is the author of 412 scientific contributions, which include 103 research articles in international journals with impact factor, 26 publications in referred national ISI journals and national referred proceedings, 25 international books and book chapters with special issues, 14 research articles on international referred proceedings, 48 papers and book chapters for the popularization of freshwater ecology and phycology topics. Professor Cantonetti is the guest editor for 8 international journals, which include Ecological Indicators, Science of the Total Environment, Hydrobiology, Water, etc. He is the associate editor of 2 journals, Phycologia and Wetlands, and also the member of editorial board of Journal of Limnology and Water. Professor Cantonetti, book series editor of Diatoms of Europe and ad hoc reviewer for 81 different journals. He has organized 19 international congresses and special sessions and has chaired 17 sessions and has given 19 invited talks at international level. Professor Cantonetti has participated in various scientific, he is a member of various scientific societies, including International Society of Limnology, Society for Freshwater Science, member of the International Coordination Committee, Ecological Society of America, International Association of Hydrobiologists, European Geosciences Union, International Society of Diatom Research, and International Phycological Society. Professor Marco has supervised 7 PhDs, 3 postdocs, 17 MScs, and 13 bachelors. He is scientific coordinator of more than 30 projects, international tenders, and consultancies. With this brief introduction of Professor Marco Cantonetti, I request Professor Marco to deliver his talk. His talk will be on a benthic algae-based overview on the characteristics, main impacts, water exploitation, global change, etc., and stewardship of the different types of freshwater environments, healthy water from healthy ecosystems. Professor Marco, please go ahead. Professor Marco, you can unmute yourself. You can unmute and go ahead. Your presentation is visible. Professor Marco, you need to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
And the presentation is on the screen. So thank you very much for the kind introduction and for already mentioning the title. My aim in this presentation would be, since in these times we are, or most of us, or almost all, are so restricted in their possibility to travel, I would like to take you in a quick journey in different places where I had a chance to study different categories of freshwater ecosystems. And in the time available, I will try to mention the main features of these different categories of freshwater ecosystems, the main impacts they suffer, and possible stewardship actions, and also consequences for freshwater biodiversity conservation. And all this will be done keeping in mind the thought that systems that are able to maintain, to be preserved with a higher ecological integrity, normally also are able to deliver better ecosystem services, and in particular, higher quality water. So the talk was inspired by a special issue. Today I will have time to mention only very briefly some aspects. If you want to find a more detailed account of several things that I am going to tell you, you just can Google Cantonati water MDPI and special issue on freshwater biodiversity, and you will easily find this special issue, which has an introductory paper which has a topic which is strongly related to this talk. Of course, what we are going to say today, and I am very happy to have that you were so kind to invite me to talk to an international audience in this special day, the World Water Day. What we're going to say is strongly related to several sustainable development goals. Of course, especially the one dedicated to water, number 6. But from the point of view of the ecologist, I am primarily a freshwater ecologist, where we need not only to make available clean water and healthy water for people, but we also need to understand the value of leaving some of the water in the natural ecosystems to preserve biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So water is, without a doubt, at least from my point of view, the most important strategic resource. As you know, we have a lot of water on our planet, which is nice, but only a tiny amount of water, 0.01%, is fresh water, unfrozen fresh water. But this tiny amount has a disproportionate importance from a point of view of biodiversity, because it hosts about 7% of all known species. Here I took a list of most important problems in freshwater science. And you can see at number 1, we still found the pollution and eutrophication. Then we have aquatic invasive species, the effects of altered hydrology, both due to human and climatic causes, habitat destruction, climate change, effects on water quantity and quality, lost biodiversity and endangered species, water quantity, demand, and management. We will hopefully have the possibility to touch several of these broad problems during the talk. This is just to try to summarize my scientific interests and find a fil rouge also for the talk. It's a bit different because luckily I could deal with many heterogeneous problems and organisms, but the fil rouge could be that all studies are related to studying the impacts of different stressors, such as water exploitation, pollution, and a threat multiplier like climate change, and study them on very different categories of freshwater ecosystems. I studied a lot springs, especially starting in the Alps, but then in many different places of the world, but also large lakes, high mountain lakes. Here we live in a beautiful mountain region like you are doing. Mares, Mediterranean streams, tropical freshwater environments. And the ecological effects of stressors on these systems, more specifically on what? On biodiversity, on ecosystem functions, on the conservation ecology, and on the capability of these systems to provide goods and services. So during the talk, as the title reminded, I will use the organisms that I am specialized on and that I normally use as a model organisms, the algae, including the cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria and algae, here there is a modern representation of the tree of life. And I had to cut it to get it into the screen because the position of the cyanobacteria and of the main groups, basal groups of algae are in very different positions in the tree of life. And here also you can see, or maybe you have to trust me that it's possible or it's known that the origin of the main algal groups is polyphyletic, and that the plastid of the Archaeplastida evolved through serial endosymbiosis, and in this way generated also some of the major groups of the phytoplankton of the oceans, such as dinoflagellates and diatoms. A few words about the groups I study most, diatoms and cyanobacteria, starting with the diatoms. Diatoms are highly interesting organisms. One impressive or their most unique feature is that they have this silica, amorphous silica glass-like cell wall, and they are a paradigm for this, very interesting for different disciplines, or also very applied engineering disciplines, such as nanotechnology, tribology, and so on. They even are a paradigm for biomolecule controlled self-assembly of three-dimensional inorganic materials. More interesting for ecologists, they are responsible for at least, probably even more, of 1/5 of global primary production. So I often tell to my students, quoting a famous song, maybe not for every breath you take, but for at least for every 5th breath you take, you should say thank you to the diatoms. Also, they have an incredible diversity. There are estimates of their diversity from 200,000 species to 2 million species. It could even, be 2 million, as much as 2 million, but probably 200,000 is more realistic. In their evolution, there has been a pervasive horizontal gene transfer between bacteria and diatoms. And these bacterial genes, they acquire completely new functions in the diatoms. They have not so much genomes and are unicellular, so with not too many genes, they are able to manage their whole physiology and metabolism. They have things that you would normally relate more to animals, like the urea cycle, but the urea cycle in diatoms is used to store more effectively nitrogen, not to get rid of nitrogen compounds, as in animals, of course. There are many diatom-specific genes, but many, as I was saying, are of different origin. They have a long evolutionary history, but let's go to the cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria, they are also incredibly important and diverse group. They are the most ancient photoautotrophic organisms. If the diatoms are responsible for 1/5 of oxygen production, if we have an oxygen-rich atmosphere, we owe this to the cyanobacteria, because they even have their own geological era during which the Proterozoic era, or era of cyanobacteria, during which they produced the oxygen, or started producing the oxygen in our atmosphere. They have very small genomes in very small cells, and they are able to manage their physiology and photosynthesis, especially with only some cells only with 2,000 genes. Several of them are able to live in nitrogen-poor environments because they can fix atmospheric nitrogen. Some have specialized cells to do that, the heterocytes, but many others can do that and are called diazotropic. They can develop stable morphotypes in stable ecological niches, which can be identified even at the light microscope, but they maintain the capability to have genetic variability, and they do that performing variation on a given theme. It's a little bit like in jazz music. They are among the most resistant organisms, and that allows them to colonize the harshest environments in the world. So let's start going through different environments, and starting with the broad category of oligotrophic environments with high ecological integrity. This is because if you are looking for diatoms, microorganisms with restricted distribution, it is in these environments that you must search. I like the example of New Caledonia. New Caledonia is far from everything, an island. The closest is the Australian coast, but it still is away 1,200 kilometers. And in New Caledonia, it's called the Galapagos of the diatoms because, for example, the genus Brachyzera has 50 species and 46 of these are endemic. But they told me that as soon as they start developing parts of this island, they build roads and bridges, the endemic diatoms are replaced by widely distributed eutrophentic, mesotrophentic, pollution-tolerant species, which you can find everywhere, including Central Europe, where I live. So now let's go to springs, which are typical oligotrophic environments when they are unaffected. I can be a bit quick dealing with springs because I noticed with pleasure that my friend Larry Stevens, the director of the Spring Stewardship Institute, will deliver a lecture in this webinar series. So springs are very special. They are unique habitats. They suffer many impacts. They probably survived as habitats just because they are very numerous. There is an estimate by Glacier that there are on average on Earth 4 springs every square kilometer. They have they host high diversity, and the main reason is probably because under the name springs, an incredible heterogeneity of spatial situation is hidden. They are multiple ecotones, so that means they are transition environments, for example, between groundwater and the surface water network. And of course, they are sustaining most of the groundwater dependent ecosystems, which are very important as well. Also, they are iconic places where there needs to be a deep integration of the views of different, or the approaches of different disciplines, primarily ecology and hydrogeology. This because they are transition environments, because groundwater and surface water. They suffer, as I was saying, lots of impacts. The main one is the water exploitation. And this is happening worldwide. We are trying to make an estimate with Larry Stevens of that and many other contributing authors. And so Larry Stevens will maybe tell you that you can really talk about a silent global crisis that springs are disappearing. Why silent? Silent because it is still poorly known even among specialists. That's why we wrote on the journal Conservation Biology this urgent plea for the global protection of spring ecosystems. They are rich in biodiversity, I was saying, in particular at the regional level. We did this study in an Italian mountain range in the northern Apennines, and we could see that individual springs can be species rich or even species poor, but the regional pool of the categories of organisms that you study will normally be very high. So they are rich in gamma diversity. And when you want to protect springs, you need to protect representative springs of the different types of springs represented in a geographic area. This is a very special type of alga, is a desmid, which lives only in a special spring type, so-called LPS springs, limestone precipitating springs, in the past known as petrifying springs. It's beautiful organisms. It favors the precipitation of calcium carbonate, which happens mainly because of the degassing, carbon dioxide degassing, when the groundwater comes to the surface. And they build calcium carbonate crystals at the top of which there is a cup-shaped structure in which the desmid cell is hosted. And this organism is strictly related to this type of springs, lives only there, and is, of course, a very good indicator of springs. That's a sentence by Pliny the Elder, an ancient scientist. At his time, they were talking Latin, and this sentence in Latin says that the waters are like the territories through which they flow, or they take on the properties of the rocks through which they pass. If you add also the human impacts to this statement, you can see that in spite of being so old, 2,000 years old and more, it is a very modern statement. I could find, because some springs are very stable, even concerning discharge, others have a strong discharge variability and even dry out during some seasons. So in some springs you can find water level and discharge indicators. That's the case of these two diatoms. Acnanthidium dolomiticum is typical of waters which come from drainage basins with a dominance of dolostone rock, which is a rock that confers to the water higher magnesium content, but it is also content of springs which suffer desiccation, undergo desiccation during some seasonal period. So it can be an indicator of that, and the same applies to this genus Microfissurata that we described from springs and mires, and which is typically lives on bryophytes, so, which live in places where the presence of water is intermittent. Even slight deformities you can see in the lower left of some diatom species, so-called teratologies, can be used as indicators of some pollution or enrichment with toxic compounds. For example, in this case, metals, zinc and copper, and a metalloid antimony. So let's move to glacial streams. That's something you have also in the area of the organizers of this Congress. We have it here in Trentino, but unfortunately, because of climate change, glaciers are retreating and are deemed to disappear during this century. Still, we have glacial streams. They are very harsh environments, especially for the algae. Of course, they suffer in a huge way the impacts of climate change. From the point of view of the microalgae, especially diatoms, if you have a typical turbid glacial streams that originates from an active glacier, you have almost no diatoms because of the scouring effects of a mineral detritus on the diatoms. We published this study many years ago in 2001, and at that time the Himalaya was an excellent benchmark with low nitrate values for the Alps, which already had higher nitrate values due to diffuse airborne pollution. I don't know if it can still be like that with huge industrial and in general development that countries like India and China have had around the Himalaya. But maybe you know better than me. We also study here, we have in our region very low alkalinity environments. So they have a very poor buffering capacity, but that's due to a natural phenomenon. It's just because the rocks have extremely low solubility, so the buffer capacity of the water is very low. These rocks are menaced by or threatened by specified by acid pollutants. And it's very important to carefully identify the species because they have different diatom species. In this case, they have different pH optima. For example, this Psammotidium acidoclinatum has a pH optimum of 5.4, while Psammotidium marginulatum has an optimum of 6. They are many times, these species are not distinguished even in paleolimnological studies, which want to reconstruct pH changes, sometimes due to acidification. We have a long-term monitoring project that uses springs with very low alkalinity, and the lake that you can see in the background, that's a lake on granites. It has a conductivity of only about 10 microsiemens per centimeter. That's about 3 times the conductivity of a commercial distilled water. And due to increased weathering of rocks, which is favored by global warming, you can see in the upper left diagram that there has been a slight increase in alkalinity. And this is shown by the increase, by a change between in dominance between two different diatom Eunotia species. So also here it is important to carefully know and identify the organisms that you use as indicators. Here we have an example of studies, of prospective studies that I would like to do using my data sets on springs in different regions. One thing is that in northern Italy, we have precipitation atmospheric systems that move from west to east, and doing that they pass over industrial places like the urban areas, large urban areas of Turin and Milan, and they get nitrogen oxides which fall down as nitric acid, which causes eutrophication and acidification. So you can see that we have on average more nitrates in the southeastern Alps than we have in the southwestern Alps. And of course, diatoms react to that, diatom indicators. Dystrophic habitats. Let's move to dystrophic habitats that include dystrophic lakes, mires. These places can have a very high diatom diversity. In general, I want to mention this nice example that Professor Lange-Berthelot and his co-workers, they could find as many as 505 diatom species in a small sample, like a teaspoon of sediment of a dystrophic lake in Finland. We have seen similar things in high mountain mires. These are very selective environments, but if they are not acidified, they are very rich in red list species, especially species belonging to threatened categories of the red list, so the most sensitive species. And in species in high mountain mires, I could find as many as 72% of threatened red list species, diatom species. Under the pressure of climate change, mires, which are very widespread in the Nordic countries, everywhere in the whole Arctic, they can be the cause of a new type of acidification, because if there are less precipitation and the mires are dry, oxygen and warmer temperatures due to global warming, they favor the activity of the enzyme phenol oxidase, which causes mass release of organic acids from peatlands, and this can cause a new type of acidification. So here you see this percentage of diatoms in threatened categories that I mentioned already several times. And you can see that it consistently decreases from the top to the bottom, and it decreases in relation to two main impacts, which are the alteration of the natural geomorphology of the habitats. It can be springs or high mountain lakes and others, and in relation to the nitrate concentration. So it's an excellent indicator of human pressure. So I want to say something about water level fluctuations, which are a very important impact in many systems, especially in lakes, of course, in reservoirs, artificial lakes, but also in many important natural lakes which have regulated levels. They have a huge impact, and this is especially in the littoral zone. And this is relevant because the littoral zone, even in very large lakes, even if it is maybe a tiny fraction of the surface of the lake, it delivers ecosystem services which are unique and which are important for the whole lake by means of benthic pelagic coupling in the system. They are a very important, the water level fluctuations, very important pressure, but they are also in many systems a natural phenomenon. For example, in Lake Constance, there is a vascular plant, a forget-me-not, Myosotis resteineri, which lives only in the zone affected by the natural water level fluctuations of this lake. So we need to find a way of an ecologically sustainable, adaptive way to regulate water level fluctuations, but we have to avoid the risk to over-regulate water level fluctuation when these are natural patterns. That's the case in some lakes. Here I want to briefly mention results of a project where we had the possibility to approach the study of filamentous red alga Banja atropurpurea with many different approaches, transmission electron microscopy and genetical expression studies and ecology, so competition with the other main macroalgae and with invertebrates, and especially with mussels that need hard substrates. And this allowed us to clearly define the ecophysiology and ecology and ecological preferences of this species and show that it can really be defined a water level fluctuation specialist. If people would have looked at the original description, which is mentioned in Latin in the upper part, Adrotas molendinas, that means that the species was originally found on the wheels of water mills. So if they would have looked carefully at this, they would have understood that this species is linked to places where the presence of water is typically intermittent. So the literature about this species was very confusing. Some people even said it's a rare and endangered species, other that it is eutrophantic and so on. But really the main feature of its ecology is that it is linked to places with water level fluctuation. Studying this Banja in Lake Garda, which is the largest Italian lake, we found this as a competing macroalga, this Ulvella bullata. It was difficult to identify it, and with a polyphasic approach, we could show that it was this species Ulvella bullata, which up to 2013 was considered to be endemic to China, and so is a recently introduced invasive species. It is very abundant on the rocky shores of Lake Garda, in our largest Italian lake. Here, I want to talk briefly or mention that there can be also bioorganic, there can be chemical compounds that are indicators of water level fluctuation. This is a mountain lake that we have here, Lake Tovel. Lake Tovel undergoes natural water level fluctuation, so it is an excellent model system on how natural water level fluctuations can be integrated in the metabolism of an ecosystem. And here we could see that there is a compound which is exclusive to cyanobacteria, which is cytonemin, which is, we could show that it is produced only by benthic cyanobacteria, more specifically epilitic cyanobacteria. It's almost absent from the plankton. And it is produced only by the cyanobacteria that live in the zone which is affected by the seasonal, in this case, water level fluctuation, which in Lake Tovel are up to 4 meters depth difference. There is a very characteristic depth distribution of the cyanobacteria in this lake that we studied with pigments and with morphotaxonomy. And this is important because normally people would look on the shores of the lake to benthic species only in the upper part of this zonation, and the more characteristic and interesting species live much deeper on the substrate in the water, in submerged, on submerged rock and stones. That's the diatoms in Lake Tovel. I am showing this to show that many species have preferential depths at which, optimum depths at which they live. But I especially want to show you on the right that the water level fluctuations influence also many functional parameters, such as the primary productivity and, for example, the amount per cell of a main accessory pigment, which in diatoms is fucoxanthin. Let's move to high mountain lakes. High mountain lakes are very interesting systems, and they are also strongly exploited as to gain drinking water or water for irrigation, or in our area a lot for hydropower, and more recently for artificial snow production. Even here, of course, if they are used as reservoirs, they have huge unnatural water level fluctuations, and we found that denticula tenuis is a typical indicator of water level fluctuation in these lakes. That's a study that was published yesterday online on ecological indicators, and here in a high mountain lake, we could show that benthic diatoms, especially the growth forms of benthic diatoms, the living forms, they can be used as indicators even if of the ecological effects of the introduction of a non-native fish species in high mountain lakes, which is an impact that affects many of these lakes in Europe. And these lakes were originally actually fishless because they are too harsh environments. Large lakes, of course, are economically very important. I mentioned our largest Italian lake, Lake Garda. Lake Garda attracts, or before the COVID virus pandemic, it used to attract as many as 25 million tourists per year, so huge economic importance. And so we have that's a reason more to take care of the ecological integrity of this system, but its water is wanted by for agriculture in the Po floodplain, where there is the most important agriculture in Italy. So there are competing interests for the resources for its waters. Large lakes of course, are threatened as all the others by climate change impacts, and of course also by pollution, classical pollution with phosphorus and nitrogen compounds. Luckily, here with the diatoms, we could show that using old slides from the 70s, that there has been an improvement in the ecological quality of the shores in the case of Lake Garda from the 70s to recent times. That's another interesting story on a large lake. That's Lake Constance, large peri-alpine lake in southern Germany. Here we we could do a study on the depth periphyton that develops on rock walls on submerged cliffs in the deep waters of the lakes. And 100 years ago, scholars, scientists, they described macroalgae, a rich macroalgae vegetation covering the submerged cliffs. And among these macroalgae, there was Bodanella lauterborni, which was considered, or is still by some considered, an endemic macroalga. Macroalga, it's a brown, freshwater brown macroalga endemic of this lake. And we could do scuba diving to see if it was still present in the lake, and it has completely, unfortunately, completely disappeared. So it has become locally extinct. Luckily, there are cultures of this macroalga. And the cause for this is this invasive species is the zebra mussel, the Dreissena polymorpha, and more recently also the quagga mussel. These mussels have completely occupied every hard substrate, and so they have outcompeted for space the macroalgae. That's another project on lowland rivers and agricultural ditches, also lowland springs. These are heavily affected by pollution and many impacts because they are in the agricultural lowlands. And the most interesting result from my point of view on this diatom study was that I found many species which are, this is in northern Italy, and I could find many species which are not yet or reported for Europe. So I will have to carefully check to see if these are really non-native, introduced, and sometimes invasive species. Also, thanks to my experience with tropical and environments in the Eastern Mediterranean, so with diatoms from warm waters, I could notice that there were several species which are typical of warm waters. It would be easy to conclude that they are there due to global warming, but I will have to carefully check this. But it is an intriguing working hypothesis. So for large rivers, I can just mention, we did this comparison within the largest rivers in North and South Africa, River Nile and River Vaal. And we found that these coiled spiral forms of this centric diatom, Aulacoseira ambigua, they are indicators, they are related to eutrophentic, to conditions, to eutrophic conditions, nutrient enrichment. And that's nice. There is a very nice paper that was even able, diatoms are a very ancient group, and they could, in this paper, show published 2017, that already they published about the ecology of diatoms in the Cretaceous era. And they found that already at that time, there are evidence that coiled forms of some diatoms are related to higher nutrients. Mediterranean streams, I had the opportunity to study them. I already mentioned Eastern Mediterranean, especially the island of Cyprus. That's an area where global warming has dramatic effects, reducing water availability, even drinking water availability. We studied freshwater diatoms in streams. Many of these streams are intermittent, so they have water only during some seasons during the year, and the diatoms are adapted to that. You have to take that into account when you use the diatoms of monitoring for water quality, and even when you develop red list species, because with some surprise, we found that the most characteristic species which you would put in a red list if you would develop a specific red list for this area, they are not typical of permanent streams, but of the harshly intermittent streams. But that makes sense, that's logical, because in this area, the natural or typical stream type is the intermittent stream. And of course, hydrology is disproportionately important in these streams. And you can see if you do variance partitioning that variables related to hydrology or stream or discharge conditions have an overwhelming importance in determining the diatom assemblages. A little bit about tropical environments. Tropical environments, I could study them while I was or I could work on materials from tropical environments while I was at the Drexel University in Philadelphia. I received them through the NEON initiative. I mentioned this to you. It's a very nice ecological program. It means a National Ecological Observatory Network. It's a 30 lasting research program that wants to study sites across the United States from Alaska down to Puerto Rico through the whole continental United States, different type of ecosystems, and they will be collecting data for 30 years to see the effects of environmental and climate change. I studied in 2 streams, and I could characterize the diatom assemblages. I just had time till now to publish some taxonomic results on the diatoms, new species and new genus. And but also the assemblages, they include new and interesting species, but also well-known species which are present with all the stages of the life cycles. With a collaborator from Egypt that I followed, have been his mentor since the time of his PhD. He is now about to become associate professor. We studied different environments in North Africa, especially the oasis of the western desert of Egypt. Here I am showing a shallow lake in an oasis in the western desert of Egypt, which undergoes dramatic increases of salinity during some seasons. And that's to address the topic of salinization. And when the saline conditions, when the salinity increases, there are species that appear which are typical indicators. They are even present on marine coasts, but are sometimes known also to be present in mineral inland waters. Maybe even more interesting, we studied the springs in these oases. And in the diagram in the upper right, you can see that the number of wells is increasing while the number of natural springs is decreasing. They are disappearing because they are using here the largest, worldwide largest non-renewable resource of fossil water, the so-called Nubian aquifer system, and that's fossil water. And unfortunately, they don't have sustainable exploitation programs for this water. And that's a huge aquifer, but it is shared by 4 countries, Egypt, Chad, Sudan, and Libya. And so that's really, they need to find more adaptive ways to study these systems, not only for biodiversity, but for the whole survival of oases as ecological, but also socio-cultural systems. In one of these oases, we could find in a mineral spring in the Siwa oasis an introduced marine species. this species was known only from marine coasts. In this oasis, we are far 600 kilometers from the marine coast. And I propose that this might have been introduced in the spring because people use the spring to rear estuary and marine fish species, and then this could be confirmed and it's an invasive species because of that. We also studied soils which are desert crusts close to desert springs, and we found new green algae, especially with this new genus of green algae, Pharaoh, with a species, generic-type species Pharaoh desertorum. I will only mention that we did the bioorganic chemistry, the lipidomics, and we found some prokaryotic traits in the lipidomics, such as the presence of acyl change in secondary position 16,3, which is typical of prokaryotic monogalactosides. So this could be two reasons. It could be because these green algae are affected by, in this very harsh desert environment, by the same environmental pressures that affect cyanobacteria, and therefore they have similar adaptations. Or otherwise, it could be that this bioorganic feature is just determined by the evolution, by the evolutionary origin by means of endosymbiosis of green algae chloroplast. So we come to the conclusions, more already in time. I am sorry this has been a gallop through different types of geographic areas, of categories of freshwater environments, trying to mention case studies, in particular the main features of these environments, the impacts, and the possible stewardship for biodiversity conservation. But I hope, or at least I did my best to try to show that if freshwater ecosystems are managed in a way that tries to keep also ecological integrity high, these environments will keep a higher capability to carry out ecosystem, to provide, to deliver ecosystem services. And so it's the general statement that we try to defend during this lecture, that healthy waters come from healthy ecosystems might be true. So especially because it had to be a quick gallop through different types of topics, I am very open to questions if there is time and if there are some. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Marco. It was really a wonderful and elusive presentation, which we cannot find anywhere. I think the sibling lovers and probably possibly the diatoms and algae lovers will find it very useful, because you have touched every ecosystem which we have on the earth, and your vast experience and knowledge in this spring ecosystems, particularly biodiversity of freshwater ecosystems, diatoms, and algae. I hope that it will have benefited the participants very much. We will take a few questions. We have 5-7 minutes. And the first question is from Dr. Samuel itself, that how far it is justified the springs or aquatic hotspots of biodiversity.
Sorry, I don't know if I understood correctly. I think the question is, how can we say that springs are biodiversity hotspots?
Yeah, you can say like that.
Something like that. Yes, well, we can. I had, of course, to be very quick, but in this case, we have another chance where I'm sure Larry Stevens will deliver a beautiful presentation on springs. I will say briefly that, for example, we had a large project on springs in the Alps. We studied more than 100. And we had the nice opportunity to study all the different categories from cyanobacteria up to vertebrates. And we could see that at the regional level, so gamma biodiversity, we found very high species pools, species numbers for all these groups of organisms. Then we did recently another work and we compared the biodiversity. We choose two groups or three, invertebrates, overall invertebrates, then water mites, which are very important because aquatic water mites, they are a group which includes a lot of springs, so-called crenobiontic species, which they are exclusive of springs. So they live only in the spring head, and their persistence is linked to the survival of these habitats. So they are very typical spring organisms. And we use the diatoms because there are many species in springs, and several are pretty characteristic of the different spring types. So doing that, we could see that individual springs can be rich or poor in number of species, in terms of number of species in these, in water mites or in diatoms or in invertebrates, but the regional pool will always be very high. And we also could show in that work that the richness is caused by the geological, by the geodiversity of the geographic area, where geographic geodiversity means mainly lithological diversity, so the occurrence of different types, very different types of rocks, the difference in the aquifer structure and things like that. These things, in turn, they reflect in the hydrochemical diversity, and the hydrochemical diversity reflects in the diversity, high diversity of primary producers, and that in the food web, this reflects in the diversity of other groups of organisms. So in the end, you really get biodiversity hotspots. And they are really punctiform hotspots because springs can be large, but in most cases they are very small. They only have a surface area of a few square meters, but even in very, very small springs have a disproportionate importance for the biodiversity of microscopic organisms. Okay.
There is, yes. There is another question.
Yes.
Do we have remarkable and distinguishing features between surface and groundwaters? And if yes, in which category springs can fall?
So groundwaters or groundwater fed systems, especially springs, they tend to be very stable during the year. So this environmental stability means the temperature, discharge, the concentration of different chemical compounds. It will not change too much, but there are very different spring types, and some can also be very variable. On the contrary, most other types of freshwater ecosystems, which have a much more developed seasonal and temporal, in general, temporal dynamics. So they are less stable. They are more prone to extreme events. And so springs often act really as a refugia in a very, I didn't have time to mention this. They can be considered refugia under many different standpoints, but I'm sure Larry Stevens will explain and mention this, which is not the case for most or for many other freshwater environments.
There is one more question. What is the scope and relevance of crenobiology research at international level?
Oh, the scope, well, one of our main aims currently as crenobiologists is actually to increase the awareness at the societal and political level of a huge importance of these systems. I told you freshwater biodiversity means 7% of overall known world biodiversity. And so the conservation of spring ecosystems is of a pivotal importance for the general conservation of biodiversity. But unfortunately, the goal is very difficult to achieve because, of course, springs are very important for water resource exploitation. And normally, when water is exploited from springs, it is not known, and there is no consideration for the conservation of biodiversity. And maybe Larry Stevens will mention, but there are ways in which you can use the water of a spring, and with flow splitters, you can still devote a small amount of the water of the spring for biodiversity conservation in a secondary environment. So there are techniques which can build win-win strategies. So we use the resource because we need the water, but at the same time, we do not completely destroy the precious biodiversity of springs.
We have one last question, sir, and that is, to what extent sedimented diatoms provide paleoecological evidences about the historical development of the present diatom community?
Well, there has been a huge use of diatoms in this sense. So also in that lake, about where I briefly mentioned the ecological effects of fish introduction in this high mountain lake, we studied both the present day littoral diatoms and the subfossil diatoms in lake sediment cores. I have done also paleoecological studies in cores taken from spring environments, that more difficult, and now currently we are doing studies with a master student and with a colleague on cores taking in Myers in peatlands. And in all these cases, we can gain an incredible amount of information from the subfossil diatoms, because they are almost always preserved in the peat or in the sediment, in the locustrine sediments. And meanwhile, with diatoms, you can reconstruct all possible factors. You can reconstruct temperature for the changes in climate, in global warming. You can reconstruct, of course, nitrate concentration, phosphorus concentration, also in a quantitative way. In a small lake, which is transforming into a mire in the Apennines, we are starting a study where we want even to reconstruct the frequency of extreme precipitation events, which are becoming more common during this recent warm period due to global warming. So these diatoms are really a very versatile tool with which you can reconstruct effectively a huge diversity of different environmental signals.
Thank you. Before I conclude, I want to thank you, Professor Morco. It was really a pleasure listening to you, showing a new world of springs to us, and how water level and discharge fluctuations and other hydrological modifications affect the freshwater biodiversity. I don't know it. I believe that there was no freshwater ecosystem which you did not mention, and you also. Yeah, definitely. We went from tropical to the temperate to mountain, then glacial streams. Then we had desert oasis, and every part of ecosystem where you have worked, you showed us how there is a biological diversity of different ecosystems. And I will end with this quote that how basically these diatoms can act as indicators of environmental change, and the studies are going into that direction also. And there is a global urgent plea for protection and conservation of springs. I believe that we need to protect and conserve these species. Before we conclude, I think that we may have, after this pandemic, we may have one-to-one interaction here. There are a lot of springs which need investigation in this part. We have thousands of springs in the Himalayan regions. I believe once this pandemic is over, we may have one-to-one interaction with you, sir. I once again thank you on behalf of department and my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Let's hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So we'll be having next presentation by Dr. Binaya Raj Shivakoti. I will request Dr. Binaya to upload his presentation, to share his presentation. Meanwhile, I will introduce Dr. Binaya Raj. He is a senior water and adaptation specialist at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, where he is working since 2010. Dr. Binaya has accumulated over 10 years of experience in a wide range of water management issues and adaptations in several Asian countries from policy to grassroots level. He conducts interdisciplinary research on pressing challenges in areas of natural resources and ecosystem services, climate change adaptation, and water resource management and sustainable development goals. In particular, goal number 6, he has received a doctorate in urban and environmental engineering from Kyoto University, Japan, and masters in agricultural systems and engineering with integrated watershed management specialization from the Asian Institute of Technology, Thailand. He will be delivering his lecture on river basin approach as a pragmatic option for the effective implementation of sustainable development goal targets on water. With this brief introduction of Dr. Binaya, I request him to deliver his talk.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Am I audible now?
Yeah, Dr.
And can you see my slide as well?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, let me start. So I would like to thank you very much for your kind introduction and allow me to thank the organizer for providing this opportunity to share my thoughts on SDG goal on water in this very timely webinar on this water health and parasite. I'm very happy to join all of you celebrating the World Water Day 2021 themed valuing water. So today, these are the contents of my presentation. Firstly, I will discuss about SDG itself. Its interpretation may vary person to person. So I hope it will set a backdrop to further discussion on the water goal, SDG 6, which will be the second part of my presentation. And finally, I will try to make a case on why adopting river basin approach could be an obvious and natural choice to consolidate SDG 6 targets along with other SDGs. For this third part, I will also take the case of Lower Mekong Basin, where we did an assessment focusing on SDG 6. And this presentation is mostly based on a chapter in a forthcoming book, Water, Climate Change and Sustainability. So before I start my presentation, let me also introduce briefly about my institute. Maybe some of you may not know. So we are IGS, we say Institute for Global Environmental Strategy. It's a policy research institute, mainly working on the sustainable development in the Asia-Pacific region. And this institute was established about more than 20 years ago by the government of Japan. And SDG is one of the area that we focus, including other issues such as climate change. So then let me start my presentation. I'm not sure, I'm sure many of you already have known about this Sustainable Development Goal, which I will be using as SDG for short throughout my presentation. And let us start with our question with like why we really need this question, like why we need SDG or sustainable development, why we are discussing about this. So the point here is like we humans have become a dominant species. not only shaping the development paradigm, including advances in science, technology, but also we are responsible for geographically altering significantly the condition and processes. So we have already crossed or rapidly accelerating towards breaching the key planetary boundaries that defines the safe operating space for humanity, such as climate change, biodiversity, ocean, water resource, and many others. So we have become so influential but in a bad way, that a new name, Anthropocene, is being suggested to mark our departure from the Holocene, which is a period equivalent to the state of a Garden of Eden, or the very impressive quote, I guess, from the Holy Quran that we heard in this morning on what we were provided. So when we speak about sustainable development or SDG, our attempt is on how we could transform the world towards sustainability in such a way that we maintain adequate social foundation and avoid situations like extreme poverty, hunger, water scarcity, etc. And on the other hand, our activities does not cross the ecological ceiling, that is the planetary boundaries. But unfortunately, our performance is poor on both aspects. Neither we are able to establish a social safeguards nor protect ecological biosphere, including the wise use of and management of water resources. So this all calls for transformative changes in the many dimensions. And that's bring us like our new effort towards concentrated and more reinforced efforts towards achieving sustainable development. So when we talk about sustainable development, so in 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and SDG was set as an ambitious path. So that really wants to transform the world towards sustainability by 2030. And the main theme was that it should not leave anybody behind. So this was like, so you might be wondering, is it a really new thing? But absolutely not. It's not a new thing. We are simply adjusting the scope of sustainable development as our situation have become more complex and uncertain. Since 1972, when we started discussing about sustainable development, and more specifically 30 years back, at the Rio Summit, which was a kind of defining moment for a global efforts to our sustainable development. And a closer look at the SDG also revealed that they are not very different. So then the question again is like, why we are so much now talking about SDG? So then to answer this point question, I think we need to revisit this another keyword like MDG, which stands for Millennium Development Goal. MDG was probably the first major global attempt to pursue development based on goals and target. So MDG did provide a lesson, and which became a key motivation to adapt to go maybe why not we adopt a goal-based approach for sustainable development as well. So. But when we compare MDG and SDG, there are certain key differences that we need to consider to understand clearly the challenge as well as opportunities that we can get from SDG. So when we see at the MDG in the past, it was mostly the selected development issue, about 8 issues, and it mainly were highly focused approach. And it mainly addresses challenges faced by developing country, less developed country, or small island developing states. And mostly it was top-down, designed by somebody at the UN and other high level of government, and then passed down for implementation. But when SDG was being discussed, there was a huge interest about making sure that everybody interests are incorporated. So That the process is started mostly largely bottom-up approach, and it is a more comprehensive than MDZ. That means also it has a bit kind of diluted focus. So it has too many focuses. And then it's meant for universal application still, but majority of the goals and target are still meant for like addressing developing or less developed or small island developing state priorities. So besides, there are also other dimensions that we also take into consideration when we talk about SDGs. So SDGs are by design and highly interlinked, and it also kind of a reflection of that there's increasing complexity in the path to sustainability. So as we talk 40 years ago and now, we talk about the same issue, but it has now grown more complex to manage or handle. And besides SDG, we also have parallel goals and other agreements that usually crisscross with SDG. But this doesn't mean just we are just adding more burden to implement multiple targets, but it is a reality. It addresses a reality of an evolution of complexities that need attention from various directions. So when we talk about linkages and so much of like complexity, there is obvious outcome is that it involves synergies and trade-off. So SDGs and other parallel goals, this involves unavoidable synergies and trade-off. So for instance, like a water is like one of the sectors where both synergies and trade-offs are prevalent. So for instance, like we may want to end poverty and hunger by pursuing economic growth or increasing acreage or irrigation. But it will have obvious externality on the environment, such as deforestation, loss of biodiversity, or excess greenhouse gas emission, or abstraction of surface and groundwater. So achieving the essence here is like achieving a SDG goal at the cost of another sustainable development goal is not an option. So co-achieving all SDG is mandatory. And that means we don't have a liberty to choose one and leave another. That won't be sustainable anymore. And another aspect of SDG is like SDG can, when we are posed with so many options, but and so varying condition, one obvious result that is one may interpret these goals in a many ways. So we may arrange, interpret, or prioritize SDG in a various manner. That means it may become one kind of story for a group of people, but another kind of story for another group of people. So what we really need to think about SDG is like the key consideration are like although like SDG are agreed by a lot of countries, but in essence they are more non-binding type of agreement, which has a kind of weak institutional framework. And there is also lack of, the one important aspect is especially related to the government and stakeholder. If they want to really contribute SDGs, there is a lack of entry point and how to proceed. So that is why my last part of today's presentation will mainly concentrate on river basin approach as such an entry point. So let us also review some of the challenges and opportunities. So SDGs bring us both opportunities and challenge. One of the key challenges of SDG is it could add a burden to the countries, especially if we want to finance implement all SDGs. And more difficult aspect is how we can track the progress, especially not at the not only national level, at the very local level. And from the previous presentation, we see like there are many ways to assess the progress. So when it comes to like so there are like a monitoring system has to be, so for many targets, the monitoring is vague and mostly qualitative interpretation. And there is also a risk that a country or a group can cherry pick the SDG or target that align with their priorities or it is the most common practices in reality actually. So usually government have their policy and budget and everything allocation, whatever the action they do and the outcome they try to relate with the SDG. So that's happening the other way around. Well, that's a pragmatic, but it is not happening within the spirit of SDG. But in terms of opportunities, like it's an good opportunities for countries to consolidate that policies and program based on SDGs. And in fact, actually, a lot of government have set up that SDG implementation structure, such as under like the Prime Minister office or setting up or under the planning commission like that. And another good thing happening is countries are also devising their own kind of tracking system based on national circumstances. For instance, I think India also has this kind of India SDG tracking system. Thailand has their own. Vietnam has their own. So there are also local innovation happening. So I hope this provide you this so far it provides a kind of snapshot about what is the scope and what is the complexities and opportunities with SDG. So now let's me move to the be specific to the water goal, that's SDG goal number 6 and other its relevant target. So if we see water goal, there are actually 8 targets and 11 official indicators so far. And if you happen to review this, it is one of the most, it's a comprehensive goal that usually cover all major issues related to water in one way or other, including the targets and disaster and climate impact from goal 11 and 13 respectively. And still, I think the first 2 targets are on drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. It's a kind of MDG legacy. It's brought from directly from the MDG. And in fact, if you see the title of the goal 6, it's ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. So this is a kind of unfinished job. So there was a debate about also its naming. If we name something else, then people might forget the remaining task of MDG. And so it came, but it also hides the over focus on water and sanitation, somehow hides other important targets like water quality, wastewater, water use and scarcity, resource management, and ecosystem. And there are 2 targets which are most on the enabling. And if we see at the water goal, it's probably the only goal which is at the core of SDG, as well as other parallel agreements, since it touches an effect and in turn also be affected by many other activities. For instance, if we talk about food, we need water irrigation. If we talk about infrastructure, we talk about water supply, irrigation, or wastewater treatment infrastructure. And there is obvious like complex nexus, for example, water, food, energy, climate, and health are the topic of today's discussion. So when we talk about SDGs, what has happened so far since its adoption in 2015, which has now, it's already over 5 years now. So one of the progress that has picked up is in part the monitoring and assessment, because for SDG there was an advantage that from MDG there was a good monitoring framework for water and sanitation. So now there is an effort ongoing to develop an integrated approach of monitoring. There is a data portal dedicated to SDG 6. And recently, there is a SDG 6 Global Accelerator Framework, which take into account like a data, capacity building, finance, and many other things that needed to accelerate with the participation of like government, private sector, UN, civil society. So this is a kind of framework is also being proposed. But what is really happening in the progress? If we see the real progress based on available data, the result are, I think, we are still behind in almost all target, although there has been certain progress in areas such as drinking water in particular, but still a lot of targets are still behind. And what are the issues that we fixed when we talk about mixed result is one is a lack of data, because a lot of indicators are yet to be monitored. And there is a slow progress such as for sanitation. And certain indicators like how to measure the participation or cooperation, the indicators are yet to be aggregated. And there is also obvious financial gap. But again, another aspect is even if we see the result, there is a huge regional differences. So for instance, if we say the water stress, like it says based on data is 17%. And but if we see the map, there is a huge differences. Like for example, the areas India and Middle East, even like China, they are South Africa. So there is these regions are already considered a water stress. Even if we say the blue area, so let's not be confused about this blue. There are also regional differences. For instance, Australia, California, we have been hearing about prolonged drought in this area and wildfire that has been in news for several years now. So there are also obvious regional differences. So what are, I think the point here is I would like to make is what are the challenges for, so except drinking water and sanitation, making progress as well as monitoring other target is challenging for many countries. And if we see the progress, still the discussion is still dominated by this WAS issue, rightfully. Water sanitation and hygiene, especially hygiene, even became a more pressing issue during this COVID emergency. And we also have a less idea whether implementation of XTG 6 is following a coordinated approach or not, considering it has so many linkages. So as a result, like a tracking resource like finance, there is synergistic impact, trade-offs or duplication, and resource gaps are not easy. So that brings me towards the final part of my presentation. That means why river basin approach. So the river basin approach here means like a kind of an integrated approach that we know for a long time. So the main first reason is that STG are by design highly interlinked. So an integrated approach of implementation is indispensable because we need a more cohesive monitoring and coordination, and also synergy. We need to maximize available resource for implementation because we cannot allocate resource for each goal and target. So the resources has to be allocated in such a way that it result into maximum synergistic outcome, that maximize outcome. And other is a trade-off. Ensure that, as I mentioned already, that achieving one goal doesn't result into either the determinant of other. So and next point here is like this water and integrated approach is also, it has a long history, like over 60 years. We are calling for integrated approach water resource management, or IWRM in short. So in fact, the history of IWRM and SDG sustainable development are almost parallel, even maybe before sustainable development goal. So what essence of IWRM? It's a very strong framework as a holistic attempt to co-manage subsectors. So it covers water supply, irrigation, stormwater, flood water, sanitation, water quality, many things inside the water blocks. And next is their interaction with other cross-cutting sectors. For example, energy, agriculture, ecosystem, biodiversity, and so many. So, but yet for the critics of one of the critics for IWRM is IWRM usually lack clear operational roadmap driving further implementation. So this is a kind of a challenge in itself. So, but Another factor we can see is even in the SDG, like target number 6.5, there is a mention about the IWRM and transboundary cooperation, which are closely related. And in fact, if we see over 50% of the countries have done some level of, or even in a high stage of IWRM implementation. But still, it doesn't mean it's in overall, but it's a good, encouraging progress, but a lot of work to be done. And if we take into account of the several international, regional, or national attempts, so globally, there is a Global Water Partnership, UN Water, and international network of river basin organization, which promote this. And similarly, there are regional effort, also development bank like a World Bank, ADB, they have their IWRM in their core part of their activities. And countries, if you see countries, you may be surprised that most of the policies, law, and strategies usually incorporate IWRM as the main instrument or framework. And recent assessment like IPCC, IPBES, GEO6, this also highlight the need to promote IWRM. And also the concept, the concept like virtual water footprint, or nexus approach. These are also stressing on the IWRM. So that means there has been a lot of work already there. So the key point here is like the IWRM. So when we talk about IW implementation challenge of IWRM, we come to river basin management. So river basin management offers a kind of platform for implementing IWRM. So they are basically a concurring concept, which seeks for the sustainable water management and water security in an integrated manner. The river basin approach, it focuses on a more special units of management. So it makes a lot of things easier. And the essence of river basin approach is that we can take into account the whole water cycle into account. So that means we can check every aspect of water cycle to check how the changes have occurred, what are the impacts, trade-offs, everything. So that means we need a kind of fresh prospect. We have STZ and we have the legacy of river basin approach. So it provides a fresh perspective. Mobilize existing institutional and policy framework river basin organization, implement STZ. So that's, I think, the point. So in order to check, I mean, there is often like a big difference between when we talk about the concept and practice. So we wanted to also check a quick assessment on how this STZ6 in particular happens to be in one of the transboundary basin, the lower Mekong basin. Maybe many of you know, that is shared by the 4 riparian countries like Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, and also 2 upstream countries like Myanmar and China. So, and it is one of the largest river basin, including it has a Southeast Asia largest lake, Tonle Sap Lake, and about 65 million people live in this region, and it is also one of the largest inland capture fisheries in the world. So this is more like the next thing about lower Mekong basin is the issues are basically common to other river basin that we see in Asia and other part of the world. For example, construction of hydropower dam. For example, there is a lot of hydropower dam development in China, Laos, PDR, and Cambodia. The water withdrawal issue, climate change impact, especially such as Mekong River flow and Tonle Sap Lake, and economic development, especially due to fisheries and other activity. So these are commonly challenges. And also in terms of SDG 6, we can see that they are comparable to many other countries, such as drinking water, sanitation, water scarcity, wastewater, and data gap. But one thing, what makes really interesting for lower Mekong basin is their approach on IWRM implementation, river basin approach. That makes it slightly different, a unique example than other river basin. So, as you may know that it is a fewer river basin where there is a strong transboundary cooperation, which was initiated by this establishment of Mekong River Commission since 1995, and it builds on a path for basin-wide approach of water resource management by this country. And it is one of the few international organizations which is governed by the specific set of rules for the technical cooperation on water-related issue, which is somehow hard to realize, especially if we talk about Indo-Gangetic plains. And Mekong Reserve has also emerged as a regional hub or information sharing and providing advice or policy dialogue and engagement, in particular like the data sharing. But at the same time, they are also one of the highly developed region, and how this transboundary cooperation can contribute to the protection of water resource and implementation of SDGs remain to be seen. So in lower Mekong Basin, the SDG within this MRC framework, SDG are still not yet explicitly reflected in their river basin development strategy. But they have identified certain strategic area which directly complement this one of the target and IWRM and overall monitoring of SDGC. So, and yeah, and interestingly, MRC has approved a set of procedures on data and information exchange and sharing, and they have also developed some strategic indicators which complement with a lot of SDG. So the question, one of the lessons that we would like to think from this MRC is in how and in what areas this Mekong River Commission as well as other river basin organization role should be strengthened to effectively implement SDGs. So that's the point I would like to bring it here. So that would lead to my concluding side about what can be the way forward, how we could promote the river basin approach for the coordinated implementation of SDG. So one aspect that we can learn is that SDG, if we see a wide range of SDG, 17 like a goal and several over 160 targets and 200 indicators, that means we cannot take this all into, we need to take a more pragmatic approach. That means we have to go in a stepwise manner. Which means we should not think about doing everything at once, and that means also achieving none. So we need to focus on those low-hanging areas where progress are already in good shape or easy to implement. So the important lesson from MRC is also that we need a kind of a joint collaboration on monitoring and evaluation, not only in SDG 6, but other relevant targets. But having said that, it is also fine not to monitor some less relevant target in the beginning. Because if we try to do everything at once, it may cause a lot of problem. But if we start from the small and maybe with experience, we can start to monitor more other targets. So it is a more like a process. And river basin approach, and there are river basin management strategy for SDG implementation is highly desirable, because there are several like river basin approach that has been already implemented, and it is a kind of a very logical thing to do, because if we see as a special unit of management, so what we need is a concerted effort, and policy challenges will be necessary to reorientate the focus of river basin approach as a unit of our SDG implementation. So, so at the end, I would like to say that we know that river basin approach has been with us for a long time, and there are also experience in terms of policy and institutional setup. from the national to local level. So in that way, we can see, and many of the program, like if we say project and program, still are designed within under the river basin management or integrated water resource management framework. So this approach has been lying in our backward, but it seems like when we are implementing STZ, we are somehow unwilling or somehow trying to knowingly or unknowingly avoiding it as a kind of a pragmatic approach or a good entry point for implementing STZ and other target and with other like a target. So that's what I would like to stress and in my slide. And thank you very much for all your kind attention, and wish you all a very happy World Water Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Binaya. Before we conclude, we have one or two questions if you wish to answer them. Hello.
Yes, please.
Yeah, we have one or two questions. If you wish to answer them, I can share it with you.
Sorry, can I don't know where are they?
Yeah, there is one question from Mr. Sharjil. He says that what should be done to avoid widespread and alarming inability to overcome trade-offs between SDGs?
Okay, thank you very much for this very important, I think, question. I think I mean, one thing, it's a kind of difficult question to answer. Like, I mean, in one short answer, it may not be easy, like a one short answer. But what I would like to say is like, we should take this trade-off as a natural outcome. We should not see it as a more like a, when trade-offs there, we should not take it as a kind of failure. I think that's important. What we really need to do is learn from those kind of trade-off. How if we happen to encounter certain kind of trade-off during implementation, because there are so many unknown, we need to take into account those kind of trade-off. But I think what should be done to avoid this kind of trade-off is, I think it needs a kind of a broader understanding and deliberation. So also it depends on where we are talking about this. Are we talking it about as a global context, or are we talking about the national context, or are we talking it about regional context or local context? So if we are talking about like a local context, for example, a small river basin approach, so there is a it won't be that hard to detect the trade-off and look for the synergistic outcome. So that is, but if we go slightly upper level, like regional or country level, that means I think there may be like the difficulty or complexity increases at that stage, because there is so many dimension or interconnectedness we need to deal with. So in that context, I think one thing that can be done is like, it is already also happening, is like for example, like a setting up kind of like a high level committee, such as like chaired by Prime Minister or Planning Commission, which have a kind of authority to intervene and directly correct the critical trade-offs. I would say not all trade-offs, but critical trade-offs. I think that may be one of the pragmatic way. But I think in a general way, I think it's still a big challenge being struggled by a lot of countries and as a global community. And I'm also not sure whether it can be avoided by the end of like a 2030. Thank you. Not a perfect answer.
Yeah, thank you. There is one more question, and from Dr. Irshad. He says that as per the goal 17 of SDGs, there need to be an effective partnership between various stakeholders. In case of conflict of interest among the stakeholders, what steps need to be taken to address this issue?
Yeah, I think this is again a kind of issue related with the trade-off. And So I think the main reason this goal number 17 was incorporated was mainly to handle or tackle this kind of issue. And if we consider about the trade-off between water sector, I think for instance, upstream, downstream trade-off. And there are also other major trade-off, like for example, water, energy, food nexus is also about discussion about the trade-off and synergy. So when we talk about like how we can avoid this kind of like a trade-off, conflict of interest, I think the solutions are manifold. So one aspect is a legal and institutional or economic solution are more strongest, but these are often difficult to handle. And this like a Mekong River, which shows like a transboundary cooperation, can also alleviate a lot of kind of conflicting interest. But at the same time, there has been a certain kind of issue even in the Mekong River, especially when like upstream dam construction, which is altering the hydrology of. So same issue like from India, Nepal, Pakistan, and many countries in the Hindu Kush region. They have a huge kind of this conflict of interest, not only between country, but even within one country. So we have a lot of issues. And so for that, I think for me, I think we have to think about the context that we are talking about, how we can deal with this conflict. But again, I think this is again a very complex issue. And of course, one aspect is if without any kind of agreement between the conflicting parties, what we need is a kind of create an environment of consultative mechanism, and then bring in the like a SDG relevant target and set up kind of local monitoring approach, which will allow all parties to detect what are the key conflicting issue, and then decide on what are the steps to be taken and monitor that. So I think that may be a kind of a solution, but it may not be like the perfect solution though. Yeah, thank you.
We have one last question from Rizwan. He says that what is the status of SDG implementation in third world countries?
Third world country means you are talking about the developing country and less developed country, right?
Yeah, less developed countries.
So if you check the indicators, not the target and indicators, you might be surprised that a lot of targets and indicators are dominated by the developing country needs, developing less developed country needs. So even if we say we transition from MDG to SDG as a universal target, so there has been a lot of targets, sustainable development challenges in the as you say, like third world country. The point here is that if we talk about the status, I think two things have been happening. So first is idealistically SDG think about like when it was designed, there was an assumption that every country will take all SDGs seriously and then they will try to implement each and every target because everything is related with sustainability. That was, but in reality, it can never happen. And what countries have done, including the third world country, is a kind of local innovation, I would say. So in local innovation, what one at the institutional level, setting up like a committee, like at the prime minister level or the planning commission, which oversee the overall like mainstreaming, the country related budget and programs with the SDG. That's one thing happening. Second thing is devising their own localized indicators. So they are, for example, Vietnam is saying like a Vietnam SDG indicator. Like Thailand has this self-sufficient economy concept. So they are aligning with that one. So this is like the second kind of activities happening. And many countries, including third world countries, are reporting their voluntary SDG report. you may want to check in the website. You will find a very interesting report about this voluntary STG reports, which will also give you a kind of impression of what is happening on the STG. And main thing that the reason I also wanted to make this presentation was again the point when we talk about making a real a meaningful progress, then everything boils down to integration, how we are basically integrating all this aspect. And that point, my attempt here now is to maybe a lot of participants, maybe some are from government or some maybe managing the water resource, directly managing in charge of water resource. So I would stress that why not you just take a kind of integrated approach like river basin management, and try to see what you can do based on what has been already built over the many years of experience. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I thank Dr. Binaya for the wonderful talk on need for SDGs, especially the goal number 6, availability and sustainability management of water and sanitation for all. And how basically we have progressed related to the water goals and the challenges for achieving these goals. He also shared how river basin approach can be used as an integrated approach for implementation of not only one goal but multiple SDG goals, including integrated water resource management. And the case study which he mentioned here, Lower Mekong River Basin, this it has emerged as a information hub for various environmental issues and policies. And I believe it has also been very important for strategic environmental assessment also, and as a guide tool for developing these studies for in the other regions. I once again thank Dr. Binaya for being with us today. And with this, we conclude the first day's session. We will be meeting tomorrow at 8:45 p.m. I request all 8 a.m., 8:45 a.m. I request all the participants that they should join the meeting 15 minutes before. We'll be having morning session at 9 to 10 a.m. by Dr. Samindra Surgeon from Losenia, USA. And then we'll be having Dr. Larry Stevens lecture on separate ecosystems. With this, I thank all the participants who have been with us for the day. I hope that tomorrow they will join early so that they can benefit from the wonderful lectures which we will be having tomorrow, inshallah, also. With this, we end the today's session. Thank you very